My mother-in-law showed up wearing my grandmother's brooch and a grin that said she already won. She walked straight up the aisle like she owned the center pew and whispered, "This isn't how it should be," loud enough for half the front row to swivel. By the time she reached the altar, the florist had paled and my sister mouthed, "Do something." "Hi, I'm Harper, 30, graphic designer, getting married to Mark in 3 months. I live in Austin, work from a tiny studio with an oversized ficus, and I plan obsessively because my brain thinks in lists. Mark's my partner of 6 years. He's calm in the way people are who grew up with a little less drama and a lot of team sports. His mom, Diane, has always been performative. She loves weddings, other people's, and has a particular way of showing it. Opinions offered as facts, gifts with strings, and helpful calls at 2 a.m. about centerpieces. We tried to set boundaries. They'd been ignored. Before we continue with the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to share your thoughts about the story in the comments. We love reading your opinions and seeing what you think about the events. Also, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We booked the Limestone House, a brick venue with ivy and hanging cafe lights, 8 months prior. It was perfect in a way that made me giddy. Exposed beams, a little courtyard for the ceremony, and a reclaimed wood bar that would look dreamy under market lights. Diane was diplomatic about most of the planning. She sent patterns for napkins and a folder of ideas to my email that she called helpful inspiration. I let some of it slide because it felt like ante to keep the peace. I regret that now. 2 days before the wedding, my sister Claire called me in a panic. "She popped by Mom's tonight," she whispered. "Left a stack of printed vows on the porch and told Mom she might have to intervene if we didn't invite Aunt Laura to speak at the ceremony. She's not hiding anything, Harp. She's parading it." Diane had never been cruel in loud, obvious ways. She preferred a slow erosion, undermining jokes. Harmless accounts to friends about how indecisive I was. A direct message to Mark's boss suggesting he should be more present the week of the wedding. But this felt different. It felt like performance art directed at the whole family with our lives as props. I tried the reasonable thing. I called Mark and we made a plan to meet Diane for coffee. He said he'd handle it. 2 hours later, he texted me a photo of his phone with a flurry of messages from his mother about a better seating plan and an instruction. "You should make sure the front is for family only." The message was insistent. I could see panic creeping into Mark's face when I came home that night. He hated conflict, and Diane knew that like a muscle memory. On the morning of the wedding, I woke up with a stomach full of static. There's always adrenaline and calm and 1,000 little details to process. But there's a different kind of dread that arrives when the threat isn't rain or missing flowers, it's human. Claire showed up at 9 a.m. with espresso and a face like thunder. "She's outside," she said. "She said she didn't trust us. She wants to be part of the ceremony, and she brought a notepad of things to say." "I told you to lock the gates," I said, too quietly. In principle, the venue had gates, but wedding vendors come and go, and venues don't lock family members out when they show up like they're dropping by with casserole. I tried to breathe and pivot. Mark and I, the bridesmaids, the planner, we ran through options we'd practiced in the odd rehearsal night back and forths. Security could escort anyone disruptive to a quiet corner. The officiant could stall. We could. I stopped halfway through the sentence because Mark's phone buzzed. He read the message, his fingers clenching and unclenching. "She's in the reception space," he said. "She's wearing the brooch from Grandma's estate, and she just asked about our seating chart." "Then she's here," Claire said. She was the only person who looked like she might actually shove Diane out the door if needed. It's easy in retrospect to grade every decision, to say I should have called the police, stopped the wedding, canceled. But there's a particular alchemy in wedding days. Momentum, expectation, 6 people dressed like Saturday's hot weather, grandparents who saved that dress for decades. You can feel the day pulling forward like tide. Walking away would have triggered 1,000 small catastrophes for guests who flew in, for my caterer, for the aunt who'd been rehearsing a speech since July. I also knew Diane. She wanted spectacle. She wanted to be the center of a room, and she'd gild her humiliation with performative tears if we tried to eject her in front of everyone. If I learned anything from our years together, it's that spectacle gives her power. So I did something both petty and strategic. I changed the venue without telling anyone. That sounds brazen, and it was, but I didn't mean cancel the wedding. I meant I was going to move the ceremony quietly and surgically to a place Diane hadn't claimed. We had a backup. My friend Priya owns a tiny art gallery 2 blocks away, all white walls and string lights, with a back courtyard that fit 50 people comfortably. Priya had offered it months ago in case of rain. It was intimate and neutral, and Priya hated drama. It was perfect because Diane didn't know Priya and would never think to show up there. The plan, and I use that word like someone who hasn't rehearsed enough to mistrust it, hinged on a small set of conspirators. My maid of honor, my officiant, the photographer, and Mark. I told myself it was the least destructive way to preserve the day for the people who'd come to celebrate us while denying Diane the theater she craved. There was a logistical ballet to pull off. The florist could reroute the bouquets, the DJ could roll the ceremony playlist to the gallery's Bluetooth, and the caterer could set up a small service area with past hors d'oeuvres. The officiant was on my side because officiants like not being part of a viral family meltdown. My maid of honor texted a carefully worded message to the groomsmen and bridesmaids. Everyone meet in the courtyard in 20. Go in quiet. Mark swallowed a laugh that tasted like stress and relief. You're incorrigible, he said, and I kissed the top of his head like you do when you want to give someone courage. We enacted the move like a theater crew doing a midnight set change. The guests, oblivious, were funneled through the original courtyard toward a route the venue staff had arranged for vendor access. The Limestone House staff were pros. They smiled and directed like everyone does at weddings when they don't want to add to the chaos. Guests filed past Diane, who lingered near the entrance with a clipboard and an air of offended proprietorship. She clapped as if applauding the ceremony she imagined she'd interrupted. I swallowed and kept walking. When we reached the gallery, Priya had already lit candles and draped an arch with eucalyptus. It smelled like lemon and nerves. The room was smaller, the air warmer, and the people who mattered, the ones who'd actually invested in us, emotionally and sometimes financially, were there, squeezing into seats that were not arranged by anyone but us. I felt a strange release wash through me as I stood under the arch. No dais, no staging, no familiar stake in how the day should look. For the first time that morning, the day belonged to Mark and me and not to an extended cast of modular opinions. But changing the venue without telling anyone is not without consequence. Diane noticed the absence of a crowd that would have gathered to witness her. She noticed that her dramatic entrance didn't have the audience she expected. She noticed a hole where attention should have been. And people notice absences like they notice bad weather, with speculation. I watched her across the room, a silhouette of outrage in a brooch that glittered like accusation. She hadn't been told. She hadn't been invited. She looked less like a wronged mother and more like someone who'd been cut out of a script. Then, as the string quartet started the opening bars and I took Mark's hand, Diane stood up. The gallery seemed to hold its breath. She walked toward us with the slow deliberation of someone approaching a stage, and every guest who had been blissfully unaware of our mid-morning subterfuge suddenly became a witness to the very thing we'd tried to avoid: confrontation. I felt my throat tighten and the plan we'd rehearsed, a private word from Mark, a calm redirection by the venue manager, an offer for Diane to join the reception afterward, collapsed into the tilt of that single stride. The room felt smaller, footlights too bright. I had acted to protect the day, but I hadn't removed the person who made me want to act. The florist inhaled, the photographer's hand hovered over his camera, and Mark squeezed my fingers until the pressure was a lifeline. I could choose to let this be the scene she wanted, loud, performative, with accusations flung like confetti, or I could make a different choice in the second it took her to cross the aisle. Before I could decide, Diane reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded note. She unfolded it with the ceremonial slowness of someone who practices dramatic reveals, and read aloud, in a voice that made the edges of the room tremble. I was promised that I would walk my son down the aisle. You changed the plans without telling me. You have taken my moment. I felt the air compress. Priya's candles flickered. Mark's jaw tightened. I had changed the venue to prevent spectacle, but spectacle had found its way to us anyway. only now it was smaller, closer, and more personal. I took a breath and did the only thing that felt true to me at that moment. I smiled, and I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Then come walk with us." I don't know if that was courage or capitulation. I don't know if it was mercy or a trap. The look Diane gave me was a kind of victory and a kind of hurt that made my stomach flip. People started to murmur, and the officiant cleared his throat like he was trying to herd a flock that had spotted a storm. I felt the room tilt, and I knew the next moments would decide something we couldn't undecide. My sister mouthed, "Are you sure?" And I nodded. Mark's breath was hot on my ear. Diane's hand hovered near mine as if she were choosing whether to accept or snatch. And then, quietly, in a voice that was steadier than I felt, I added, "If you want to stand with us today, you will stand like family. There will be no interrupts, no speeches outside what's planned, and no grandstanding. If you can't do that, you can step aside." It was a line. It was a boundary I'd rehearsed in my head but never said aloud. For a moment, no one moved. Diane blinked slowly. The kind of silence that follows an ultimatum felt heavy and charitable at once. Before I could feel what came next, I want to ask you, was I right to change the venue without telling anyone to avoid her spectacle? Or did I create the very drama I was trying to prevent by pulling a secret move? If you were in my shoes, would you have let her have that moment or stood your ground like I did? I said the line, and then waited for the room to decide what kind of family it wanted to be. Diane's hand hovered like she was weighing a scale. For one charged heartbeat, she looked like she might snatch her moment and rip it into shreds. Then she lowered her hand, and to everyone's surprise, she stepped forward and slipped her arm into Mark's. The audible relief that rolled through the room surprised me, as if a single small compliance could erase weeks of manipulation. Mark's face softened when she took his arm. Something settled in him that I'd never seen settle before. He squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you," and I felt my chest unclench just enough to breathe. We walked down the aisle to a quartet version of an old song that always makes me teeter between ugly cry and laughter. Up close, the gallery's white walls felt like an invitation to be honest, which is a strange thing to feel on a day that had already been half strategic operation. My vows were messy and true. Mark were steady and unexpectedly funny. People laughed in the places they should have, and for a moment it felt like we had pulled something fragile and beautiful out of the mess. Diane stood when she was supposed to and sat when she was told. She smiled in all the correct places. It was an oddly professional performance. I told myself that was progress, that maybe she'd seen how petty her theatrics could be, or maybe she'd decided it was better to conserve energy for later. Either way, she was not the spectacle she'd promised to be, and that let me move through the ceremony a shade lighter. Then came the reception, which I had deliberately kept as low-key as possible in the gallery's courtyard. String lights, past hors d'oeuvres, a playlist that tapered into perfectly timed slow dances. Priya had organized a small bar and a dessert table. Guests mingled in that pleasant, warm glow where everyone's smiles looked kinder in photographs. I breathed in the night and thought maybe, just maybe, we'd skirted the worst. Of course, it didn't stay quiet. Diane's brand of sabotage isn't always loud. She's an expert in the small, undermining gesture, the backhanded compliment, the helpful correction to a server, the pointed aside to a cousin that seeds doubt. By the time the cake was cut, I'd heard 3 variants of the joking, digs about my suitability as a wife, and 1 insinuation about why my mother didn't show up with a bigger bouquet. Each one landed like a pebble in my shoe, small in the moment, but persistently annoying. The tipping point came when my cousin, who's a talkative kind of guy and loves a toast more than oxygen, grabbed the mic and launched into an off-the-cuff speech about family legacy. He praised Mark's upbringing, praised Diane as a matriarch, and then, with the clumsy self-confidence of an inebriated relative, started listing traditions that implied the bride should know her place. He wrapped those words in compliments, but the undercurrent was obvious: control, and whose family values would rule. Diane's eyes shone with triumph. I felt something in me cool and sharp at that moment, not fury exactly, more like a painful clarity. I could react with the scene she wanted, raise my voice, make accusations, give her a public spectacle to amplify her martyrdom. or I could pick a path that rewired the room without feeding her narrative. I took the mic. It was impulsive and deliberate at once. People turned toward me, some with curiosity, some with buoyant smiles I wanted to keep. I cleared my throat and said, "I want to say something." My voice sounded like my own. When Mark and I planned this day, we made choices about who we wanted to stand with us. Those choices weren't about excluding anyone from family. They were about choosing how we wanted to begin our life together. We wanted a room full of people who celebrate us without strings. A quiet spread. My cousin's smile dimmed. Diane's jaw tightened. "I love family tradition," I continued. "But tradition shouldn't be a chain. It should be something that lifts everyone. So tonight, instead of letting stories about who should be in charge dictate our night, I want everyone here to promise something simple. Be kind, be honest, and if you have something that matters to say it with care." It was a kind of call for civility, but it was also very pointed. I didn't name Diane or my cousin. I didn't have to. The crowd could read between the lines. A murmur, then a few claps. My cousin looked caught and offered a stiff smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Diane sat down, her expression unreadable, like a photograph that had been retouched too hard. After the formal toasts, people started drifting toward the dance floor. The night softened in that way evenings do when the pressure drains out of them slowly. Mark grabbed my waist and spun me and whispered, "That was brave." It felt brave. It felt necessary. I don't know if bravery is always pretty. But brave words are small and ephemeral if not backed up by boundaries. I'd already set some with my mic moment, but the real work came afterward. Later, when the courtyard had emptied into night and the last of the appetizers disappeared, Diane found me near the dessert table, stirring a cup of coffee Priya had brewed. She didn't storm. She walked like someone negotiating a soliloquy. "You embarrassed me," she said quietly. Her tone wasn't accusatory exactly. It had the coolness of someone who has been taught to measure her influence in public currency. "You made me look like a villain in front of everyone." "You were trying to make the day about you," I said, and it wasn't a question. "You showed up uninvited with a plan to insert yourself. That's not a mother supporting her son, that's performance." "You think I did this for show?" She sounded wounded, and not all wounds are insincere. "I did what I thought was right." "You thought other people owed you a moment. You decided to take it." My words were steadier than I felt. "If you want a role in our lives, you have to meet us where we are, not demand the stage." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment the jewelry and posture fell away and I could see not only her ambition, but the loneliness beneath it. "I wanted to do right by my son," she said. "I didn't want to be left out of his life." "You won't be left out by me," I told her, honestly. "But you won't be allowed to erase us by making us props for your version of love." We stood in the frozen glaze of the dessert table and made what felt like a contract. She would stop public scenes. She would stop sending directives to Mark's job. She would take a break from planning suggestions. In return, I promised to invite her into our lives in ways that felt real and reciprocal: dinners, holiday planning, small responsibilities that would keep her close without giving her a microphone to wield. She agreed reluctantly. It felt like a truce more than reconciliation. The months after the wedding were a slow, uneven rebalance. Diane called less triumphantly and more conversationally. She showed up at Thanksgiving with a dish she hadn't announced, and she actually asked if she could help rather than dictate. There were still small jabs, a passive-aggressive text here, a pointed comment there, but they held less power because I had set a precedent. Public spectacle would not be how our relationship advanced. Mark and I learned the hard lessons about boundaries and alliances. We built a quick wedding archive, an absurd little digital folder with photos, receipts, and timelines, because we both liked the sense of control and proof it gave us in the age of social performance. We also started monthly check-ins where we talked about things like family dynamics and emotional inventory. It was honest and sometimes awkward, but it kept us aligned. I don't pretend the story has a tidy ending. Deanne and I are still learning the rhythms of being in each other's lives without a hierarchy. Sometimes she flubs, sometimes I overreact. But we are learning to value the quiet, day-to-day ways a family shows up more than theatrical declarations. If I had to re-answer the question I asked under that quartet's opening bars, was changing the venue without telling anyone the right move. It saved us the spectacle of a stage set in my in-laws' living room. It also forced her into a different kind of confrontation, one that was quieter and in some ways more revealing. I don't know if I'd do it the same again. It felt like a necessary lie to protect a day I wanted to be ours. So I'll ask you, because wedding days are a collision of love and theater, and sometimes both, was I right to move the ceremony in secret to avoid her grandstanding? Or did I commit a betrayal by pulling a private trick that took choice away from others? If you were in my shoes, would you have let her have that moment or quietly rerouted it like I did?